Welcome back, everyone. We have invited a special guest to deliver today's lecture. His name is Benjamin Ferencz, and he is 100 years of age. I met Ben a few years ago while at Harvard University, from which he graduated in 1943. The war had already broken up in Europe, but that's around the time when the war was brought to the United States with the attack on Pearl Harbor. This motivated Ben, of course, to mobilize, like the rest of his nation, in defense of his country. And as soon as he was able to, after graduation, he joined the U.S. Army as an infantry soldier, seeing combat in all five major battles of the war on the Western European front. He eventually transferred to the War Crimes Investigative Branch of the Army. And it was in that capacity that, alongside obviously other soldiers, he began to liberate many concentration camps. The horrors of the war and of the concentration camp have scarred Ben for life, and to this day are the fuel that propels his work in advocacy. But I first want to take this opportunity to first welcome our guest, and also to pose my first question. The Nuremberg trials initially were about wars of aggression and what were at the time called crimes against peace. However, your trial, the trial of the Einsatzgruppen, what you argued before the court wasn't as much about crimes against peace, but it was crimes that had been perpetrated by the Nazis against innocent civilians. In fact, your trial came to be known as the biggest murder trial in history. Can you tell us about how this shift happened? How did you come across evidence of the Holocaust? How did you come to collect evidence of the murders, in particular that the Einsatzgruppen have been carrying out? And why were you so adamant to see them tried?
First, let me place it in the broader category that you've outlined. The Allies, the victorious Allies, had to decide what to do about the Germans for having started these wars. Germany had invaded all the other countries, killed a lot of people. They said, let's charge them with making war itself. That'll be the crime of aggression, and were crimes against humanity and regular war crimes. There was the International Military Tribunal. Justice Robert Jackson was the representative for the United States. They had a very specific top leaders in the dock whom they put on trial for their various crimes. And then the question came up, well, what about the rest of the people? And the United States felt that we should have more than just an overview, a quick snapshot of the few people. We should take each category of society and ask, how was it possible that a civilized country like Germany would allow those things to happen and would make it happen? And these were called the subsequent proceedings at Nuremberg, in distinction from the International Military Tribunal. The subsequent proceedings then were divided into 12 different trials. The doctors who performed medical experiments on the innocent victims. You had the SS, which did the actual murders. You had the Foreign Ministry. So we had 12 additional trials. In that capacity, I was invited to go back and work on the subsequent trials. And I put together a staff of about 50 people. I set them up in Berlin, which was the central headquarters for German archives. And I began to try to match archival documentation with the suspects who we already had in the jail in Nuremberg. In connection with by doing that research into all the German Nazi organizations, I came upon Ereignis Meldungen aus der UdSSR, I'm showing off my German, which literally translated meant situation reports from the Eastern Front. And what were these super reports? I read them, and they were, of course, in German, top secret. And I took a little adding machine and began adding up how many people they killed. When I reached 1 million people killed on my little adding machine, I stopped the machine. I took documents. I got on the next plane from Berlin to Nuremberg. I flew down to see General Telford Taylor, who was then in charge of the subsequent trials. I said, General, we've got to put on another trial. He said, I can't. Budget has been approved. The lawyers have all been assigned. We can't go into new trials now. Well, I lost my cool a bit. I've got 1 million murders in my hand. We're not going to let him go. And he said, well, can you do it in addition to your other work? And I said, sure. He said, okay, you do it. And so I was 27 years old. It was my first case. And as you mentioned, the biggest murder trial in human history. I said to the court, the case we present is a plea of humanity to law. And the people had been murdered because they didn't share the race, the religion, or the ideology of the executioners. And they were all convicted. I didn't call a single witness. I said, I don't need any witnesses. I have their top secret German report to their higher headquarters. I have their signature and what they say they did. I don't need any witnesses. And they deliberately kept it obscure. Einsatz means action groups. But they didn't want anybody to know what this assignment was. And their assignment was to kill without pity or remorse every single Jewish man, woman, and child. That was their assignment of the Einsatzgruppen action groups. And they wrote their reports. And they had a very misfortune. I found their reports. I had their reports. I said, let's go to trial. And so that's how it came about.
Ben, thank you for discussing with us the challenges of delivering justice through trials at a time when, of course, so many innocent civilians have been murdered, and it would be inconceivable to think that just trials would deliver justice. Because we are trying to grapple with concepts of justice, fairness, and human rights in our class. Did you feel you achieved justice in Nuremberg?
You're quite right to ask, was justice done? And I asked myself that question. I remember very well. It was a Sunday morning. The trial was start on Monday. And I said, well, there's no way in the world that I can take 22 defendants and hold them accountable for murdering 1 million people and think that justice has been done. There's no justice can be done. If I could create a rule of law which would protect everybody in future, which would be enduring, that would have a value.
Can you tell me why, in your concept of justice and peace, it is important that not just perpetrators are punished, but also the victims are helped?
You can't just walk away. They had nothing but a tattoo on their arm. Their homes had been taken, their families had been murdered. They were lucky to be alive or unlucky to be alive. And you have to do something to make good. I learned that in the first grade in Harvard. If you do an injury to someone wrongfully, you have to try to make good. Either undo the harm if you can or compensate for it. So it was a very simple principle of justice.
In your mind, it was clear that first you needed to stop the war, then you needed to punish the perpetrators, then to have some justice or a rounder sense of justice, you had to assist the victims. And finally, the most important thing, the one that you've been working on the longest, you needed to prevent that from happening again. And in the vision of world peace that you have highlighted, why the International Criminal Court is so important to you?
Seems simple common sense. If you're having a dispute with somebody, there are two ways of settling it. Either you or God try to kill him and he tried to kill you, or you go to a third party, a court or arbitration tribunal to settle it. Those are the two options. And if you have the two options and you don't have a court, you don't have any options. You're back to war again. In my mind, there was no choice. It seemed such a logical conclusion. I said, we need an international criminal court, a permanent international criminal court, so that there's an alternative to going to war. And strange as it may seem, it's not easy to get it accepted.
Ben, in our classroom, we talk a lot about values, the values enshrined in human rights law, the values enshrined in the UN Charter. I would like our students today to also get a sense of what were the values that inspired and propelled Nuremberg. How was the trauma that the international community went through with the war, and the trauma that individual people like yourself and others went through with the war? How did that influence the decision to, for the first time in history, put the question of Nazi guilt for war crimes before a tribunal, rather than turn to revenge, vengeance, and retribution as it had been for whole of human history?
Well, I've had my share of war. I've had enough of it, quite enough of it. I have seen the horrors of war itself, and it's horrible, believe me. I went into the concentration camps. Innocent people just herded up together because of their religion, and beaten to death, starved to death, killed, shot. And I saw the bodies lying on the ground, the crematoria going, the people looking like they're half dead, their eyes pleading for help. I've seen that man's capacity to be cruel to other human beings. And it has provided me with a trauma which I cannot lose. And I've got to try to change it. I can perhaps say it should not have died in vain if we can use their death as a stepping stool to create a more rational and more humane world order. In the opening statement, I made clear that vengeance was not the goal, that we were trying to create a new rule of law which would protect everybody, because these people were murdered because they were different. There's no justice can be done under those circumstances. There is no equilibrium possible. If I could create a rule of law which would protect everybody in future, which would be enduring, that would have a value. I did say in the closing statement that these defendants wrote the blackest page in human history. Death was their tool, life was their toy. If these men be immune, then law has lost its meaning, and man must live in fear. That was my closing presentation. So it was a different type of approach to say, go, hang him, and so there was none of that. You have to find the truth and build a juridical system to give them a fair trial. Fair trial was a basic requirement. It was a philosophical approach, looking to the future. And I'm looking at the future now. That's you and your students. Where do we go from here? Never be discouraged. There's no reason to be discouraged. We have made great progress. We have good people on the job in the United Nations and outside and in the courts, and they're all striving. But it's not an easy thing to do, to change. And that was my goal then. And that happens to be my goal still now. And I'm going to be 102 pretty soon. And it's not an easy thing to do. But I'm glad that we're having some of the Oxford students pitching in, because I look to them, to the future. And I look to the next generation, to finding the tools to make it a more humane world. So that's where you're helping me, and that's how I answer your question. It's a work in progress. So I wish you all the best of luck, and thank Oxford also for making it possible.